Welcome to the Quick Stop F1 podcast. My name is Mario, and you could have been anywhere else in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate it. Got a great show for you today. If you're on YouTube, make sure you do your likes, your comments, your subscriptions, your notifications. You tell a friend of a friend. Same thing for Apple and for Spotify. We've got a Patreon too. But let me introduce to you the better half of this podcast. She's got fits that don't quit. She's the brains. She's the brawn. She's the talent. She's an artist. Introducing my co-host, Tasha.
Hi.
Hey.
Hello. I'm feeling the rhymes today.
They flow better now. They flow better now. I'm going to make them rhyme one day.
Okay.
Yeah. Maybe I'll do a haiku one day. It'll be great.
Yeah.
How are you, Tasha? How are you?
I'm good. I'm really excited for today's episode.
Super excited because we have our second guest.
Woo! We don't have the soundboard here.
We don't have fireworks. We don't have that kind of budget. We don't have that kind of budget. With us today is Bryson Sullivan, aka Natural Paradigm. And Bryson, how are you? Thank you for joining us. Thank you so much for joining us.
I'm doing great today. Thank you guys for having me. Happy to be here.
We're really excited to have you.
Tasha sent me a message and she was like, testing is happening. There's so much things we can talk about with the technical aspects. And just like she did last episode, she knew exactly who we needed to bring.
Yeah.
To talk some technical stuff.
Bryson,
immediately.
For sure, It was during launches, actually. Yeah, because I saw some stuff and I was like, I need somebody to help me out. And I feel
it's actually been a little bit tough this year because I have had some changes in my job setup and I'm a lot more busy than I have been before. I've been always busy, but now it's even more busy. So I haven't had a chance to analyze everything I'd love to see, but I can certainly offer some input to what I have seen and certainly give some tips for what to look out for this season.
Yeah,
absolutely. We saw you. I wasn't there personally, but earlier saw you doing your Spaces thing. Mm-hmm. Talk a little bit about that. Is that something you're planning to do throughout the season?
Yeah, I mean, it is something that I like to do. I think one of the things that's nice about the online community is that how knowledgeable it is. Mm-hmm. There's a remarkably high level of technical understanding and understanding about F1 specifically that's just in the community. And you can have really fantastic and multi-layered conversations with people just in the live audio format. And so Twitter, now X Spaces, has been a nice way to do that. I have done them in the past and they've been very successful. I'll try to keep them relatively, well moderated. It tends to be pretty chill in my Spaces.
Yeah.
But I'm trying to do them more regularly because people seem to appreciate them. So we had one today. It was pretty good.
I agree. I was there listening. So it actually I was like, just what I wanted to hear, some of these stuff, you see on testing, it's really hard to kind of decipher it or interpret it all. So yeah, it was really nice. And I love other people chiming in and asking questions or saying something that maybe I was thinking. And so it's just been nice to kind of, hear the community, have that, banter back and forth and actually teaching each other. And I'm learning what's going on. So yeah, I felt like it was a great space.
I mentioned in the last episode in the intro that I did for Tasha, one of the things I said was she still takes notes with a number 2 pencil. And the reason I said that was because it was coincidental. I went into your space last week and lo and behold, who do I see in the list? It's Tasha. And I'm like, are you and I here just listening right now? Yes, we are. Yes, it was so cool. Yeah. So definitely right off the bat, recommend anyone listening to this to check out one of those spaces.
They are recorded, by the way. If you want to go back and look at them, you can go back and open them. Right now, you can only open them inside of X, but later on, I might record them externally. We'll see how that goes.
Okay.
Nice.
Okay. So before we dive into all of the F1 specific questions and everything, I know that I'm really interested by. I want to get it completely correct. What's your school to your degree in? Do you have multiple? Is it aerospace engineering? What is it?
Yeah, I have multiple degrees. I have a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering from Purdue, and I have a master's degree in aerospace engineering from University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And most of my graduate school work was in hypersonics. Really, this is things moving, at least 5 times speed of sound, very high Mach number, very high velocity, and some interesting compressible flow things like that, scram jets and, compressible boundary layers and all that kind of stuff. but it impinges on my Formula One stuff because I'm just a huge aero nerd. Again, I'm not claiming to be the greatest aerodynamicist or anything. I'm certainly not. I've done my fair share of aero work. I'm just extremely passionate about the subject and I find it really cool. Yeah. I'm definitely the one who's like looking through F1 videos. Like, okay, I see a little vortex there. Is there a little bit of condensation there? Can we look at the trajectory of this? And the thing is, if you know what to look for, you actually can see things that other people don't see or can't see. But you have to know where to look. And I enjoy kind of sharing that passion with other people. It's really the main thing.
That's awesome.
That's exactly what I wanted to hear.
Yeah. Literally what we're here for. Sorry to cut you off, Tasha. Just wanted to know, like, both two questions. Number one, the engineering side of you. Was it ever since you were a kid you knew I'm going to do some engineering? Is it something you fell into? And completely, like, on the other side, when did you become an F1 fan? Is there like a favorite memory you have for the sport, or like the day you said, like, man, I love this?
Man, my entire family is populated with overachievers, right? If anything, me getting an engineering degree is like not doing enough. We're talking, airline pilots and teachers and doctors and, cool people overall, actors in my family, some people but no, I mean, the engineering side of it, it's just been something that I'm good at. And that's wherever I tell people, whenever someone says, oh, you have an engineering degree, how cool is that? I'm like, calm down. I'm not good at anything else, first of all. and secondly, I was already on this trajectory anyway. But I mean, my dad was a pilot, so I definitely grew up around the aviation space. And as any like young kid was going to do, I was like, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do something else. So I got into cars, like really big into cars and motorcycles initially. And then the fear of death kind of changed my trajectory a little bit. I mean, it's a real thing we talk about. But I got really much into cars. And in college, I was in FSAE, but then I just started taking like fluid mechanics classes and like compressible flow classes and aerodynamics. And I was like, oh, I'm getting turned to the dark side right now. I'm getting turned to the dark side. So the aerospace side of it has always been there, but I kind of rebelled against it a little bit early on. But now I'm kind of folding into it. And just the background, my job right now, I work on jet engines. Is really what I work on, developing and testing and building jet engines. And so that's really interesting work, but there's a lot of commonality between the physics of some of these processes and what happens in Formula One cars. Yeah. Now, how did I get into Formula One? Mm-hmm. This is what I love about talking about, because especially American F1 fans, everyone has a very different trajectory to how they got into it. I got into Formula One a long time ago, like 2005, 2005, I was into it. And the way I got into it was a complete accident. I was working with some friends and they were just super, super hyped about going to this F1 race. They wanted to go. And I just like failed to say no hard enough. and they successfully dragged me to this race. And I can tell you, just describing to someone what Formula One is like in words doesn't do it justice. And I wasn't convinced that I was interested in this. But as soon as they got there, it was in Indianapolis, and I just saw a car go by me at 320 kilometers per hour, like 30 feet away from me. I was like, this is not exactly what was advertised. Yeah. And not only the speed of the cars, but the skill of the drivers, right? To be able to take a machine that can do this type of thing and actually take it 10/10, take it to the limit of performance. This depends on like wind gusts and weight distribution and all these cool things. And seeing these cars, as I say, dancing on the limit of adhesion, that is what really excited me. I'd never seen cornering at 5.5 G. I'd never seen braking at 6 G. So it's really the engineering side of Formula One that's always drawn me to it. The driver part of it, the politics and the dynamics of that are certainly interesting, but it's really the technology of the cars itself that really hooked me into the sport.
Very cool.
That's cool. I love that.
I need to ask one more.
Go for it.
I studied electrical engineering. It's not really as interesting or fascinating, and you can't even see electricity, so who cares? But look, I wasn't a 4.0 student, but I did fine. But Calculus 3 made me look in the mirror and ask, is this really for you?
Those vectors got you, huh?
When you're telling me, look, it's like an avocado. You look at it from the inside, from the outside into the avocado. I was like, I don't see that. So I don't know what I'm, so like calculus 3 took me 3 times.
Yeah.
But we're here. We did it. It's funny now. Was there any class that, I'm not saying you were flunking or anything like that, but any class that like hit you harder than the other class, or like made you really like, damn, I got to sit down and do more than ever to be able to like really get through this class?
No, I mean, the math and engineering is hard. It's always going to be hard, especially vector calculus and stuff. That's not really a surprise. I don't think that was necessarily. I think I kind of had the opposite effect, which was that I took a class and I realized I wasn't doing enough, because I don't think I really planned on going necessarily going to graduate school and getting into all this aviation stuff. I was kind of just going to end with a bachelor's degree. But I took a graduate level compressible flow class as an undergraduate, like 500 level class. And it was like so good. I was learning so many things. I was like, oh, there's a whole other side to this that I don't even know. I need to do harder. I mean, just to give you something simple, think about like a solid rocket booster for a rocket engine. You just think of, there's solid propellant in there, and you light it off and it, produces thrust. Mm-hmm. But the cross section of the shape that they cut that propellant out of strongly dictates how the thrust changes as a function of time. So if it was just a circle, as you burn away, the surface area increases with a square of the radius. So it's like a really like peaky, thrust. You don't really want that in a rocket. You want like a linear burn. So they do like computational techniques to like cut like star shapes and complicated cross sections. So as it burns away, you get a constant exposure of new area and like linearize the thrust versus time. And I was like, for lack of a better word, that's cool as shit.
Right.
Like that's one of the coolest things I've ever seen. And so that was one of those key moments where I was like, it's not that the engineering was too much. It was that actually I was more into it than I thought I was, and someone else teaching it to me kind of exposed that to me.
Any more questions?
I also didn't struggle at all in anything.
There are always classes that are harder than others, but I think what I remember most in the back of my mind is not what I struggle with, but what actually like pulled me through certain things, and that was certainly one of them.
No.
Yeah, I like that a lot. Okay, I need it. All right, I'll be chill now. I had to know.
That's a good question.
So last thing, F1 before technical. Any favorite driver, favorite team throughout your tenure?
Yeah, I mean, so Lewis is definitely the driver that I respond most to. He kind of looks like me. I mean, like a better version of me, like an older, more attractive version of me. Right?
It's okay.
I think you understand what I mean.
Yes.
But I responded to him, and the way he came onto the scene in 2007 was wild. It's tough enough to have a world champion as your teammate in any situation, but to have a world champion as your teammate and being the defending champion and actually take him to the limit and beat him in the end was just extraordinary. And so I certainly have been enjoying watching his journey as an F1 driver. I'm loving the idea of his story being a trilogy, being a McLaren side and a Mercedes side and Ferrari. It's a very bold move to go into someone else's team and want to perform, but more power to him. And Mercedes has been a really good team to follow over the years. Before that, I would probably say I liked McLaren. Even before Lewis started, I liked McLaren. I think the Formula One car that really, pulled me into the sport and say, man, this is an insane machine, was probably the MP420, that McLaren that Kimi Räikkönen drove in 2005. And if you go back and look at the history of that car, Adrian Newey was involved in the designing of that car as well. Oh, yeah. So it's not really a surprise to me in retrospect that one of the sort of benchmark cars for me that really got me interested in the sport was connected to one of the best designers it's ever had.
Yeah.
So.
I recently learned, this is just a random fact. I recently learned that Adrian Newey designed a Red Bull car for a video game just because they told him, create me a car with no like real life limitations because it's a video game. And there's an actual, I think it's the RX-20 or something like that is in the game. And that was...
It is. I have seen the car. It has some very interesting design elements, including faired wheels, which I've discussed a couple times and everyone hates, but I've talked about it. The one thing I will dispel about that car, though, it's often believed that because this car is capable of 11 Gs cornering and some insane thing, that wearing a G suit would help you prevent you from passing out. That's actually not correct. Okay, because what a G suit does is it squeezes your legs. It compresses the lower extremities of your legs to prevent blood from pooling there. That only happens when the G forces are vertical, like a fighter pilot would. You'd bend into a turn and you'd roll the aircraft and pull it back, but the G forces you experience are in the vertical axis. When you're in a Formula One car, the G's are horizontal and they're forward and backwards. They're not vertical. So even if you have a G suit, that would be interesting, but that's not actually what's going to make you pass out. Lateral acceleration is not going to make you pass out. Now, granted, it will be very marginal through like Eau Rouge and through like turn 14 at Zandvoort, where there's banking, then there is a vertical component of the acceleration, then the G suit would help you. But in normal terms, when we think of Formula One cars, the Gs are experiencing are lateral Gs. They're not vertical Gs. And so a G suit isn't actually as effective at keeping you from passing out in that direction. Just one point I had to get in because
that's
great. It's often misstated.
So one of the things that I wanted to ask is, and it's perfect. It's like something you see often is during testing, do not pay attention to lap times, right? So that's like the thing you cannot do. So let's dive into testing a little bit and let's initially so I don't look at lap times. What can I look at in testing and actually say that holds like value for maybe Bahrain next week? And it doesn't need to be like from a team specifically this season, but like in general, what are you looking for?
The one thing I've promised to do to people that, value my opinion and ask me for things, I promise not to lie to you guys. Okay. And I would be lying to you if I told you to completely ignore lap times. I would also be lying. I would also be lying to you if I told you to take lap times as absolute truth. The reality of the situation is lap times don't mean nothing, but they also don't mean everything. There's somewhere between not nothing and everything that actually matters. That's why it's so difficult to disentangle lap times and sort of just get through the things that are obfuscating the question to figure out real pace. Okay, so there's definitely that performance side of the question. But if you're asking me right off the bat, what should you look for sure, you want to look for reliability. You want to look for laps on track. You want to look for body language as well. And I don't necessarily mean body language of the engineers or GP, Max's race engineer
smiling ear to ear,
smiling ominously.
That's pretty ominous. It looks pretty ominous.
Now look, that is a data point. Yes. That is a data point, and that we should be scared about that. You should. But I'm actually talking about body language of the car itself. How does it react to the driver's inputs? Is there a disconnect between what the driver is expecting the car to be able to do and what it actually can do? Are you pushing wide into turn 8 trying to brake? Have you gone over the bump at turn 9, that fast left-hand kink, and then have you bottomed the car and spun 360 so that everyone makes fun of you? Right? I mean, that is something that can happen to anyone. I'm talking about Logan Sargent's spin, by the way.
Yeah.
He can be made fun of for a lot of things. But that particular spin, I choose not to criticize him for. But what's the body language of the car like? Is it snapping on power exit? Is doing these types of things? How does it behave on low fuel? Like a single lap run versus high fuel when you're actually having a lot of kilograms of fuel in the car. It costs roughly 0.3 of a second for every 10 kilograms of weight that you have in the car. So when you really put a bunch of fuel in the car's gonna be like 5, 6, 7 seconds lap slower than you would normally see. So that's why the lap times aren't going to matter as much. But what does the body language of the car look like? And also how repeatable are the lap times? How is the degradation? Is the lap time increasing by a certain amount every lap? Or if the tire degradation is really good, as you're burning off fuel, you're actually going faster and faster as the stint goes on. These are the things that I would most be interested in. And if you want, you can look at traditional body language of the team. How do the drivers look? How do the engineers look? I can tell you right now, I love the smile I saw on James Allison's face
over big testing.
Now, to be clear, again, I can't measure the diameter of his smile and get real precise with it. But what I saw was someone who was very confident that they had achieved what they set out to achieve, but still does not have something capable of beating Red Bull.
Right.
I think that Mercedes has built a car. Again, they've completely reinvented their entire philosophy to how to build a car. I think they've built something that actually has a lot of potential, but they don't actually know how to extract the maximum out of it. I saw the Mercedes driving very low to the ground, lower testing, getting a lot of sparks. That's a good thing because the W13 sure as heck could not do that in Bahrain testing. It was porpoising like crazy. So the fact that they're able to run the car that low already is a positive sign. And, you know, Verstappen and Red Bull, there was every expectation that being aggressive, being revolutionary more than evolutionary with their car design this year, taking design cues from Ferrari and Mercedes and everyone else would trip them up. That does not seem to be the case right now, based on everything I can tell. So look at body language, look at the number of laps the team does, and look at how the team is responding to the way the car's behaving. Driver feedback is always positive, but sometimes they don't tell the truth either.
Right.
So you know, that's what I would recommend for a starter.
So one thing that came to my mind, I'm sorry, real quick. One thing that came to my mind was with what you were talking about, I saw that Max Verstappen had a stint on C2s, for example, and the sector and lap times were super similar, like throughout all of those laps. So I guess that's an example of something that you see and is like a good sign of how the car is doing.
Yeah, that's definitely the case. Now you have to be, it's good for two reasons for the car. One is it indicates that the tire degradation is low enough to where the fuel burn effect and the tire degradation effect are kind of canceling out and you can kind of hit that same lap time. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, it could also mean that they actually aren't pushing cars hard as it can go.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So tire degradation is worse the harder you push the car. And if you are deliberately driving conservatively to hide your true pace, that also makes it easier to do these metronomic lap times, lap after lap. So Bahrain is a rear limited track. It's a lot of like traction zones, slow corners you're accelerating out of. There's not that many high speed corners except for maybe like turn 6 and turns 11 and 12. So if there's a tire degradation like benefit, which Red Bull's had the past couple of seasons, you're going to see it at the race. But other tracks that we're going to come up to, you know, Australia and Jeddah, those are actually fundamentally different tracks. And so I wouldn't take the result that we see in Bahrain and then just like copy paste that to every other track. It's going to be different, and it's going to be different for the reasons of track layout configuration.
Nice. So I guess sort of not backtracking, but then in that case, what is actually being accomplished here at testing and versus what we're going to see this coming week when they go do practice for the race, so to speak?
But I think the most important thing is to figure out what they've actually built and to be able to correlate the performance of the car they've actually built to what's being told in the simulator. Another side thing is actually finding the real limits of the car.
Right.
Like how low can you run it? How stiff can you run it? You know, we try to figure out what the ultimate limits of this machine that you built actually is, and then translate that back into what the design said. But the reason why the aerodynamics part of this is actually so important is because, yes, you can do CFD. We always call CFD a virtual wind tunnel, but it's not. It's not perfect. There are certain areas that it's really good at, certain areas that it's not so good at. Different teams use different CFD tools. They're all the same. They aren't necessarily going to give exactly the same answer. Why isn't the wind tunnel perfect either? The wind tunnel is a 60% scale model, but more importantly, the people don't think about as much. It's not built out of the same materials that the F1 car is built out of. So it flexes differently under load than the way a real car would flex. It has scale tires that Pirelli gives them to be able to emulate tire deflection and get the contact patch right and all the other stuff, but it's not perfect. You never know what the real car is going to do until you actually build the real car. And you may ask, well, why would you put like a rake of pitot tubes or something to measure the airflow? Well, yes, you can measure suspension loads to figure out exactly how much downforce the car is making. You can say, look, this is the car. It weighs, 1,000 kilograms. I've got at this speed, 1,200 kilograms of downforce. Excellent. But then you say, okay, wait a second. Am I getting that downforce because the parts I'm using are working correctly? Or was I just driving into a headwind? Right? Because if you're driving into a headwind, your car airspeed is higher than like the ground speed, and it's the airspeed that matters for aerodynamics. So you have some of these probes on the car to be able to determine what the airspeed is, irrespective of what your ground speed happens to be based on GPS or wheel sensors or whatever. And then you can non-dimensionalize the forces that you experience in the car by the appropriate aerodynamic parameters, and then compare back to back to the test situation to say, aha, this really is because of a geometry change. The car really is working the way it's supposed to be working. This is not just like some artifact of a windy day giving us more downforce than we were expecting. And also, you can look at the pockets of clean air and dirty air coming off of the car. Are they where they're supposed to be based on your CFD? And how intense are they? I mean, this can give you so much information that you wouldn't get otherwise. So the teams are definitely figuring out what car they have, right? That's a big part of testing. And also exploring the limits of what this car actually can do. Because sometimes what something can do is more important than what it was designed to do, if that makes sense. Like once you actually build the hardware, you say, okay, how far can I actually push this? Rake or ride height or anything else like that. And these cars are incredibly sensitive to setup. I would say setup is just as important, if not more important, than doing any upgrade. You can put an upgrade. This is not like Gran Turismo. You can't just like bolt. You can't bolt an upgrade onto your car and say, "This is This is going to be half a second, no matter what."
Right.
You have to figure out how to make the car work with it, and that requires setup.
So I did not know. I have no problem. I have one of my better qualities is that I have no problem putting myself in the I know nothing position. Today I learned that the car that you put it on the wind tunnel is not exactly the car that goes on track. I truly thought it was like a actual replica.
It is in terms of geometry. It is geometrically similar, but the way what I'm suggesting is something a little more second order, which is even if you make it exactly the same, the exact construction of a wind tunnel model is not identical to the exact construction of the actual car. The engine isn't the same. The gearbox isn't the same. It's fundamentally different. And so, yes, normally it can be different ways that you can correlate or predict, but you never really know for sure until you drive a car on track.
Absolutely.
No, that's really interesting. And I understand, like, it's like if you build the moment you build two things differently, like the variables that you're adding into it are too much to actually say, no, they're the same. It's the same thing. So they're looking for correlation, not exactly what I'm saying here. One thing that I've heard with testing is basically these teams are going into with simulations, right? Like all sorts of data that was simulated. By the way, CFD, computational fluid dynamics.
Yeah, sorry if I didn't mention that before.
No problem. So all of that is basically simulations and testing that is done before actual put it on track. And then is the best case scenario on testing for my simulated numbers to be super similar to the on-track numbers? Is that like the layman's way to say like this would be the best case for a team?
I think it actually is. And if someone says, actually, no, we're making even more downforce than we predicted in the wind tunnel, that would be fun. That would be interesting for performance in terms of the real car, but it wouldn't be understanding.
Right.
If you don't understand why the car is making the amount of downforce that it is, then you can't exploit it in future designs. It's just like, oh, we got lucky this time. So the best case scenario would be either the data matches, as precisely as it can. It never matches perfectly. Or you can come up with factors to explain why the performance was different. It was a hot day. The tires were slightly different. We could update our models to account for this. But the best possible situation is, hey, the car does what you expect it to do in the configuration you made it. And then as a bonus, when you make changes to your car, maybe you change the angle of your front suspension if you're Mercedes, if you're trying to do something tricky with your suspension. And then the car behaves on track the way you predicted it would behave in the simulator based on that change. That's even better because it means not only is the car behaving the way you expect it to behave now, but the changes you make in the sim are accurately reflected in the track. So you could have a high degree of confidence, hey, if I change this piece of data in the simulator, I'm finding 3.5 tenths, 4 tenths at Monza. Then you can actually have confidence you can build that part, bring it to the car, and then have it ready to go, and it will deliver.
I just want to say that I love what you said was like, it clicked for the first time that something good is not good unless I can explain it. Like, unless I can justify it with like, oh, this makes sense because it was too hot this day, or the wind was too much this day. As long as I can justify it, it's a good thing. But if something good happens and I don't know why it happened, then it's not as advantageous.
It's not the end of the world.
It's not exact. But
it's not as advantageous as of knowing why something was good.
You mentioned the front suspension, and that was one of the things that I noticed a lot of cars kind of changed in, like when we were watching like launch launches, and so many were mentioning moving to different suspensions. So I kind of was curious, like, what are the advantages and disadvantages of doing that for these teams?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of touch and go for the front suspension, whether it's like pull rod, where the rockers and everything, and the suspension arms go to the bottom, or if it's push rod, where the rockers are at the top of the suspension. The rockers are just translating like motion this way into motion that way, right? Okay. Because they use torsion bars instead of springs. So there may be some marginal like aerodynamic benefits one way or the other for the front suspension, pull rod versus push rod. Most teams seem to be going that direction. Steak is going into Sauber. I'm going to call them Sauber. Don't let me call them Steak.
Absolutely. They don't call themselves Steak.
Yeah, we'll get to all that. But Sauber is they switched to a pull rod front suspension, and that's something that McLaren has had from the very beginning, and something that Red Bull has very noticeably had from the very beginning. Okay. We've seen teams adding more anti-dive geometry to their suspension. And essentially what that's doing is making an asymmetry between the vertical position of the two mounts of the upper wishbone. So the suspension has wishbones like that, right? And you can mount them to the chassis. And if you change the relative position of the two mounts of the chassis, you can change the roll center of the system. You can actually change the way that the car behaves, and you can reduce its tendency to pitch and dive under braking. Or if you do the reverse of that on the rear suspension, you can reduce its tendency to squat when you're like accelerating. Now, why do we care about these things? Is because these cars are heavily reliant on ground effect aerodynamics, which is very sensitive to not only how high off the ground the car is, but its rake angle. And you can say, well, don't you just set the rake angle in the suspension? Don't you like set that as an engineer doing your job? You do. But the thing is, the car pitches due to vehicle dynamics. It changes angle and there's nothing you can do about it. So if you can make that more benign, you can get a more stable aero platform, the drivers can extract more out of the car. So pull rod versus push rod front suspension is something that's kind of marginal. But what we are seeing a lot more people go to is push rod rear suspension. Now, push rod rear suspension moves these major elements, these actuator elements, to the top of the gearbox instead of the bottom of the gearbox where it was before. And it turns out that the consensus is this gives you more room, more real estate to do things with aerodynamically. Maybe you can tighten up the back of the gearbox or the Coke bottle area of the car a little bit more. Maybe you have a little bit more volume for your diffuser. And you can use different shapes for the diffuser that are more optimal for creating downforce. And so that's another slight misnomer. We talk about diffusers a lot, and we talk about them, like slowing down air. The thing about it is the diffuser is really like the boundary condition that makes the really low pressure under the car possible. Without a diffuser, the pressure underneath the car is going to be roughly similar to the pressure like in the back of the car, which is low but not super low. But a really hard working diffuser with a big area ratio can have a huge difference in the pressure coming into it, which you want to be as low as possible, suck the car to the ground, and the pressure at the back end of it, which is low but not as low as it could be. So I think push rod rear suspension is something that most teams are starting to go towards because it gives you more options in terms of aerodynamics for the back end of the car. Notably, Ferrari and Haas have not gone in that direction. Ferrari because that's their own decision, their own reasons. Haas because they take their parts from Ferrari. They don't have a choice. But Williams was taking Mercedes' gearbox and suspension previously, but they've actually decided not to upgrade to the current Mercedes rear suspension. And James Vowles said it gave them 4 extra months of development time. If they just said, hey, we're not going to use your new suspension, we'll use the old one, it gave them 4 more months to prepare their car for development. And so that was a gamble that he took, and we'll see how long it lasts.
Yeah, he also mentioned something like it saved him like $1 million as well in the budget. It's interesting. So, I mean, I guess along those lines, like what are some of like the pitfalls potentially of that, like not taking a new gearbox to...
Yeah, I mean, these things are system level questions, because even if I mentioned before that there are benefits for like aerodynamics to make the push rod suspension better, there's also like a debit for like mass properties. When you move these things to the top of the gearbox instead of the bottom, you're moving it higher off the ground. Well, the higher your center of gravity is off the ground, the more load transfer you have for a given deceleration. If you're braking at 6G, the load distribution of the load imbalance between the front axle and the rear axle increases the higher your center of gravity is off the ground. So every like kilogram of mass you put higher up in the air is going to actually take a load away from the tires, the rear tires under braking, and the inside wheels under cornering. It's kind of the same type of deal. So there are definitely trade-offs to this. What I would say is they've made their own decision as to what the best use of their resources are for their program. Williams is not, totally strapped with cash constantly. I can understand the benefit of getting 4 months extra development time and not spending $1 million or whatever on suspension could work out for them specifically. But for Mercedes, who has ambitions of grand scale when actually fighting Red Bull sometime this century, they have to make real changes, and one of those real changes was changing the rear suspension.
So you really, it looks like innovation is the way that you have a new chance at competing as much versus just, I don't want to say just like it's so easy, but versus copying a concept from a different team, for example.
Yeah, I mean, we have to be subtle here because, ideas... You
can say no and that I'm wrong. That's perfectly fine.
No, I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm saying there may be nuance here because, first of all, nature knows the difference, which is to say, if you copy someone else's car and it just kind of roughly looks like it, but it's not really optimized, it's going to be worse performing, not better. Yeah. But that being said, so often in Formula One, we've seen situations where someone has seen a design, seen an idea, and say, actually, that is a good idea. I can make that work. Not only do they copy the idea of it, but they do the precise, detailed design work that's necessary to actually optimize it for their car. Perfect example is looking at the Red Bull RB20 engine cover. It's got these huge, like, hulking shoulders like the W14 did last season. And if you look at that car in detail, the design inspiration is clearly there, but also equally clear are the modifications that they made to make it work for their car. The gullies aren't straight front to back. They're sort of bowed. They go outwards a little bit, and kind of like the way Ferrari side pods used to back in the day. And if you look at the part of it where it goes down right before the rear wing, that's sloping down far more aggressively in Red Bull's car than it was in Mercedes' car. And so they're finding ways to take an idea that actually and manipulate it to make it work for them. So all of that stuff to say, innovation is definitely a driver in Formula One. It is very much an engineer's championship as much as a driver's championship, if not more. Right? I mean, a lot more, depending on whose car you have. But that being said, it is possible to look for inspiration from other teams on the grid and go through the rigorous process of adapting that for your setup and finding lap time. That can definitely happen.
Yeah, we definitely saw like Newey going up and down the paddock with his.
Oh, he stays going through the paddock. He stays going through the paddock.
But it would be so funny because he'd stop at Mercedes, he'd stop at Haas, and people will be like, those cars aren't doing that great, and laughing at the fact that he potentially is taking notes for them. But then you see this year's concept, and he borrowed kind of heavily from other teams that it didn't work on their cars. How does that necessarily translate? In terms of you see something on another car, you think okay, I can implement it in our concept. Like, how does that necessarily become part of the new design and the concept?
Newey's been out here moving mad.
Yeah.
To be honest,
we see that.
he has been collecting design concepts like Infinity Stones. I mean, he's Thanos out here. And the thing is, that's good. That's good because so many people in the sport believe in what I've called a mythology of engineering, which is they believe, hey, good teams are smart, bad teams are dumb. Right. Good ideas come from the good teams, bad ideas come from the bad teams. The direction of information transfer is one way, and if you try to copy them, it's just not going to work because of the reasons that I mentioned previously. But the reality is that every team has smart people in it. That's what makes losing so painful, because every team has smart people in it, and they're coming up with good ideas. We know Red Bull in the past has used design cues from Williams for their diffuser before. We know that in the previous generation of cars, Haas had a very interesting idea for the Venetian blind sort of vanes that we used to have next to the barge boards in the old generation car that produced a ton of downforce actually towards the front of the car, which is even more valuable. And everybody loved it. So the one thing I want to emphasize here is every team is having good ideas, and they can come from anywhere for any team. Newey looking at other teams and actually looking at what they're doing and actually incorporating them successfully by appearances into this car can only be celebrated for that, and it should not be something that we say, "Oh, you're copying. This was inferior." Like, it doesn't work like that. It's not how it is. That's the first thing. But in terms of how you like process that, we talked about CFD and wind tunnel work before.
Yeah.
The new designs and new parts that we see on a car at a track are the tiniest fraction of a fraction of geometries and ideas that were eventually tested. There'll be a bunch of concepts that people think might work. Then there'll be a lot of CFD evaluations. And CFD is great because since you're not actually building a car, you can change the geometries very, very quickly and say, okay, that's good, that's bad, that's good, that's garbage. You can pare down the possible list of ideas to a very precise number. Go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt. We've talked a lot about CFD. Just want to get a good image of like, is it as simple as saying you build a model of the car in a computer model of the car and then put that through simulations? Is it purely software that they're using to do this?
There are empirical constants that are baked into CFD simulations, but in principle, yes, you're taking geometry and you're applying boundary conditions to a physical simulation in the domain around the car. Now, the one thing I want to be clear about is there's tons of models of the car. There's manufacturing models. There's other things, but you can't use those in CFD because they're far too detailed. They have gaps. They have screws sticking out. They have all kinds of things. So one of the things I have experience with in my past is taking a model from manufacturing and simplifying it to generate a tight air solid, is what we typically call it. Something that has a surface that's uniform, no overlapping edges, no splines, anything weird. Just a nice surface that you can mesh in a sort of discretize with a CFD solver and then computer solution with. So, and there's other levels of multi-physics simulations as well, where the car can pitch and dance and things that we can get into. But in principle, the simplest form of a CFD simulation is you give me a geometry, you give me an orientation of the car, I give you boundary conditions to run that in, and I will tell you the forces and moments or tendencies to pitch and roll caused by the aerodynamics. That's really what CFD can do for you.
Awesome.
So perfect. So a small number of designs are actually put in CFD. An even smaller number of designs are survive CFD and make it to the wind tunnel. And even a small number of designs from that actually make it to the car. But if you're talking about, Newey walking around getting ideas from people in the paddock, there's an entire train, a development train from, maybe physical drawings, some hand sketches, some model geometry, evaluating in CFD to see what floats and what doesn't, so to speak, then building some wind tunnel parts to evaluate those. And only the ones that survive the wind tunnel have a shot at actually being put on the real car. Now, to be clear, there's a slight problem there because CFD tools aren't perfect. The wind tunnel isn't perfect. It's possible you could have a false negative and see a design in CFD or the wind tunnel that, looks like it's bad, but in reality, if you actually built it, it would actually be good. But the whole point of having these tools is that you minimize their error as much as possible and maximize the correlation so that genuinely good designs in CFD will be good designs in reality. But we always have to be honest with ourselves that there is a gap there between real to measured, if that makes sense. And you're just trying to down select the designs that work and build a fast car.
So my question would be, in that case, I guess maybe two parts. One, how much would you say the RB20 has changed from the RB19, like maybe in terms of percentages? But then also Red Bull had, I think, the least amount of CFD time and wind tunnel time. So how were they able to so drastically change the concept of their car without having as much, I guess, testing as like Haas would have, for example, or Williams would have? And you see that their cars aren't dramatically different from the previous season. So I guess...
Or good.
I mean, shots have been fired here today. Haas catching strays.
Poor Haas. Haven't been through enough.
So just to talk about this, there was a lot of talk early on, especially from Adrian Newey, saying that the RB20 was going to be an evolution of the RB19.
Okay.
That really isn't what we see when they actually showed us the car. And again, I will give them credit for showing us a physical car as opposed to showing us a show car and pretending it's a real car. So kudos to them for showing us a real car. I would say like 30%, 40% of that car is fundamentally different just from the outside, probably more from the internals to make all of that work with the inlet changes, the halo changes, and all. I mean, there's a lot of changes that have been happening with that car. At least 30%, probably more than that. But in terms of how they're doing that, is a bit of a mystery because the cost cap is designed to limit or to put a brake, so to speak, on unrestricted development of the top teams and preventing them from outspending everyone else and just being uncatchable in that sense. That does seem to have hampered McLaren and Mercedes and Ferrari and preventing them from implementing changes that they would love to implement over the course of the season. But Red Bull just seems to have nailed that, not only from the perspective of getting the regulations right to begin with, but the developments that they do bring are universally effective. They haven't brought too many updates, but the ones that they have brought have been very powerful. I think the most notable one would be the change to the inlet geometry in Hungary they brought last year. As you remember, they were just making the inlet of their radiator, so the side pod inlets, thinner and thinner and thinner. We couldn't believe how thin they got in Hungary. Yeah. And the thing that surprised me about that is that it worked. Their setup actually worked the first time, despite how hot it was and everything else. It actually worked just fine. And so for Red Bull to be able to do what they're doing, they limited the number of developments of the old car, giving them more resources to work on the current car. And then the other thing is they have very, very good correlation between what they expect their updates to do and what they're actually doing, on top of the fact that they just have really good ideas as well. Right. So Red Bull seems to be so well poised to benefit in this era of regulations, not only because they got the right answers right away from the very first car, but that's given them a time delta to be able to work on these things more than other people. But also they're continuing to add ideas to it. And just to be clear, the main reason Red Bull went so aggressive this season is because Newey, according to Newey himself, he believes that if they kept another iteration of their previous design philosophy, they would be vulnerable. He said they would be vulnerable to the catching pack. Now, the implication of that is that they're no longer vulnerable, which is a little bit scary.
Right.
But,
ominous, is like everybody has been saying.
they seem to have really nailed it. And so it's on the rest of the pack to catch up at this point.
Yeah, with what you're saying is like the level of confidence of simulation to on track is like really high at Red Bull, because like they come up with these ideas and they're just like suspiciously all hits. But related to the same topic that we're talking about, what have you seen from Toro Rosso or that like credit card team? Like, have you seen a lot of similarity between these two cars? Is the car actually, and I know that there's better ways to ask this, but like, is it really that much similar to the RB19? Do they have similar new concepts? Like, how different or how similar do you see these cars?
I don't see it as a clone of the RB19. It's no more a clone of the RB19 than any of the other cars on the grid that are going in that similar design direction. And yes, it's true that B-Carb or RB or the Faenza team, whatever.
Yes.
It's true that they take a lot of parts from Red Bull and try to take as many parts as they can for sure. But Haas tries to take parts all the time from Ferrari. Let's be honest about the situation. The reason why we're all fearful of this is because we think they'll be successful in a way that Haas has not been. Yes, Haas takes parts from Ferrari, but there's never been any realistic threat of them going to the front of the grid. Despite the cost cap things making it easier for them, they just aren't there. Now you look at V-Carb, and depending on how they do in Bahrain, there could be some serious questions asked about that kind of performance coming from that partnership. Now, to be clear, the problem isn't so much taking customer parts from a supplier. McLaren does that, Aston Martin does that. There's ways in which you can make that work. What seems to ruffle everyone's feathers, especially Zack Brown, is that these are two entities owned by the same company. And we don't have any indication that there's a violation of rules going on in terms of information transfer. But it's almost like the rules themselves need to be adjusted to account for this situation to actually maintain a fair playing field.
Yeah.
I agree.
It's difficult because we in our conversations we compare it to any other sport, and it just doesn't make logistical sense to me where you have two teams fighting against each other, same owner of the team. Like it's just to what you said. Like there are rules, and even if you tell us that they're all following the rules, I just think it's a messy situation. You, as a sport, you shouldn't just be you should just not be in. Like, the possibility of them doing anything illegal should just not be possible by not allowing two teams to be owned by the same person. But that's just like my personal opinion.
I feel like
on
Zack
that.
also made a great point more so about like maybe the political end of the spectrum, where you basically have a team that can sometimes vote against its best interest to help support the A team. So I think maybe that's more even where he's coming. The Concord Agreement, I think they're about to remake one. So I don't know, like, if any of that plays into it and like what behind the scenes is happening. But I think that stood out to me when he was speaking. Like, that seems to be a big issue of you don't really have 10 independent teams, and then you basically have a team working against its best interest to suit the sister team. And, I think that's just more the interesting part from, I guess, what I took from Zack.
No, I completely agree with you. I think that's actually the core of the matter, in fact. So.
Yeah.
I wanted to backtrack slightly back to Red Bull, because you mentioned that Newey said that they kind of were feeling a little bit vulnerable. And I believe like maybe pre-testing, there was like some talk about like Red Bull kind of hitting the like limitations of what's possible with this concept, something like that. I feel like I understand on paper what they're saying, but what does that actually mean? Like, there's only so many things they can do with this concept, obviously, before other people catch up. Like, I don't know. I found that kind of an interesting thing. I don't know if it was just because I feel like they nailed regulations. I guess I didn't see a way that there wasn't a way that they could like improve on that. Do you know what I mean?
I do, and I'll give you an example to try to explain this concept in a little bit more flavor, so to speak. Do you ever see any jet airliners flying around today that are biplanes? No. You don't see any, right?
Yeah.
Do you think that's due to like a lack of creativity?
No.
It's not, right?
Yeah.
The reason is because it's the same physics for everybody. It turns out that a long, high aspect ratio cantilevered wing is the best type of design for a transonic commercial aircraft. And in a similar vein, the rule set that we have made for Formula One does exist within, the wider context of physics. But if you're using a certain design philosophy to achieve the aerodynamic objectives of the car, for example, more downforce, less drag, more repeatable downforce, less variation, with wind sensitivity and things like that, each concept does have an upper limit of what you can achieve with it, like purely from like, how low can the pressure get here? Or how high can the pressure get here? How sensitive is the car to pitch and things like that? I mean, there are differences to these different design philosophies that will fundamentally change what the car can do. Now, you're saying, okay, well, is there a hard limit? Like, you can't go above 5.6. It's not quite that. It's kind of like you're clawing at something and you just can't make any more progress. Right. And if you do make progress in that same period of time, while you're struggling for the 0.1%, the people coming behind you, copying your idea, are just making up ground to you because they're going in the same direction, and they're going to eventually end up where you are. It's a kinematic restriction more than anything else, which was just to say the possible motions in that space are limited. There's an upper ceiling somewhere, and if you're close to hitting it, even if you're making incremental progress, the person behind you is making more progress each time step, if that makes sense. And you will be caught eventually.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting because this is year 3 of the regulation. And I guess within the first 2 years, they'd already kind of met that limit or that limitation or kind of getting close to it. So I don't know if was that necessarily like a feature of these regulations or a bug? Like, is it meant that they want the teams to kind of like develop faster and change concepts faster within these like few years, or did they anticipate somebody getting it so right that, they're now changing it 3 years in?
I think that all regulation sets have this inherent property where there's a step change in what the drivers or the engineers are required to make, and it takes time to sort of react to that and fill it up. But if you leave the regulations constant for long enough, eventually everyone will figure things out. And it's not just a question of, have you gotten the overall concept right in the first year? It's almost like, what new details are you finding? What tricks are you finding? what ambiguous language have you found in the regulations that we can now exploit? We've never seen a front wing like Mercedes is before in this regulation with the cutback, with a cutaway center section of the front wing. Not because the regulations changed to make it possible, but just because people have spent more time thinking about it. I mean, this is why whenever you talk about, oh, this is the perfect design, I've made this perfect thing, you look at it and you go back 12 months later and you're like, I could do this differently. I could do this better, just because you've had more time to think about it. And so these engineers are incredibly clever men and women, and they will find lap time where they didn't have it before, even though the regulations haven't changed. But I don't think it's necessarily a feature of this current set of regulations. They have been geometrically restrictive in ways that other regulations haven't been, but that just makes the engineers more creative about how they're finding lap time. And so it's a constant battle between the FIA telling teams what to do, teams saying, okay, I will do that, and then like not actually doing that, like doing something slightly different. And the FIA coming in and saying, actually, we've been what we said, you can't do this, you can't do that. And so the net result of that is going to be greater performance, more downforce, less drag. And we were talking just the other day about this drain cover problem at Bahrain. That's not because Bahrain has like shoddy workmanship or anything. It's because the cars are more powerful. They're finding performance. You want to find lap time. You do that by creating more downforce. More downforce is sucking the car to the ground, but it's also sucking the ground up to the car, right? I mean, this is Newton's third law. So I mean, this is fundamental changes over time, resulting in improvements in performance.
So the drain covers coming up is a good thing.
It's
not like not good for the drivers, but in concept,
it can actually be dramatically bad for a driver if you hit it. But it means that the engineers are actually finding performance where it didn't exist before. Granted, drivers are going wide and taking a very wide line, turn 11. We can talk about that whole thing. But in terms of, are the engineers using their entire workflow from conceptual design, CFD analysis, wind tunnel, detail design, building it, they're finding more performance that they didn't have before. Go ahead, Mario.
So really it's like literally more force than ever being like just downward. So then you get that equivalent force upward. And that's why it didn't happen before, but now it happens with specifically the drain cover. Yeah,
it's not really force for force. It's really force per unit area for force per unit area. And force per unit area is pressure ultimately. So it's like for every every square foot additional, you have more force in pounds, that you're generating. And so, I mean, and also the cars are heavier too, and that also isn't helping. And when you add the tire deflecting and hitting the drain and the floor goes over and sucks it up, it can be a serious problem. I mean, I don't know if you guys saw what happened to George Russell in Baku, I want to say 2018, 2019, where he sucked up the entire drain cover. And it was the impact of it hitting the car was so powerful, it lifted the front wheels off the ground. I mean, it was a wild collision. So it's something that we have to look out for in the future.
We've talked a lot about it, but I want us to actually dive down to tracks. You've mentioned a lot of like different turns of different tracks. So first thing I want to know, just because it's relevant to right now, Tasha and I have spoken before about street circuits and street tracks like Vegas or like Chicago or like when they want to go to New York, etc.
Chicago's not real yet.
No, absolutely. But when I think about street tracks, forget what I think about. What are your thoughts with like the difference in competition or how much is required from a technical standpoint of a vehicle in a street track that's maybe slower versus a quicker one? I guess what I'm really saying is like, what is your favorite setup for a track that you think really pushes the engineering of the car more than the other tracks?
Yeah,
does that make sense?
It does. I mean, it's a challenge because there are really two questions. One question is, how do you engineer a race car to win a race? Like, what can you do? Hey, this is the car, this is the track. How do you figure out tire pressures, temperatures, and everything else to win a race and pit stop strategy? How do you do that? That's one question. Another question is, what combination of car and track produces the most spectacular performance?
More like
370 kph and like cornering at 6G, and that's the kind of stuff I want to see. I want to see that kind of raw stuff. So for a track like that, it would be more traditional circuits like Spa and Coda, and that's where I really love the performance side of it. But on the street side of it, the most difficult track from an engineering side is probably Las Vegas. Las Vegas was interesting because there was this weird, it's like November. First of all, so it's super cold. They should have known that, but super cold. And we're used to, in almost all of our races, the air temperature being like a certain delta from the track temperature. Maybe it's like 10, 20 degrees or what have you. In Las Vegas, the air temperature and the track temperature were like the same number for weird reasons. I mean, this is like in Celsius, not Fahrenheit, so you have to figure that out. But it was like track temperature and air temperature, 18 degrees. That's a crazy, weird situation to be in for an engineer, because you have to be able to warm up your tires to be able to get them warm. You have to cool the brakes. You have to have an appropriate amount of cooling to keep the engine cool. But if it's that cold in the air temperature, not only do you not need more cooling, you're actively trying to like blank off parts of the cooling to stop airflow from going in it, because you don't want to overcool things. That's also a problem. So I think in terms of like a race engineer's challenge of engineering a car to perform at a high level on a street track, the hardest one may have been Las Vegas. And the other factor with street tracks, for any new track, but even the same track, is you never really know exactly how much grip you're going to have at the track. Yes, you're given models, you're given information about what the surface is supposed to be like, but in some situations, like Las Vegas, they literally like put the tarmac down before the race, like right before the race. So like you don't know exactly what the detailed grip characteristics are. This is why track walks are so important, and why Pirelli takes that weird little rolling like drone looking thing. It has like 3 wheels. It'll measure the grip by using some special sensors in that. So that's one of the things that you don't get until very, very late. And depending on what the inherent grip level of the track is, it actually will change the front to back balance of the car and the way it handles. If you guys remember back to Turkey 2021, or maybe it was 2020, it's probably 2021, where Red Bull just had a terrible weekend because the track surface was so much different grip level than they were expecting. They set the car up for a certain grip level and it was different. And they found it, it really affected their performance. So yeah, street tracks are fine. I don't want the entire Formula One calendar to be street tracks. We have to have a certain number of traditional tracks, and we have to have a reasonable distribution of tracks in different parts of the country. You mentioned Chicago. I'm just not in favor of the Chicago track because we are represented already right now in all 3 time zones. We have Las Vegas for the West Coast, we have Austin for the center, and we have Miami for the East Coast. Everything else is excessive in my mind. So that's a whole other topic, but
I agree.
No, I saw I did see you had very good comments during the announcement of the Chicago GP, and that like, this isn't, I remember one of your tweets was, this is not the way that you do it.
I think I said, don't. That was the entire tweet. The entire tweet was don't do this. But no, I mean, look, there are ways to proceed forward with this that make the most sense. I just don't think that's where we are right now.
Yeah. So you mentioned, just to do a quick like technical challenge, Vegas, Spa, and Coda are exciting to you from a technical standpoint of like, it's difficult to get that setup just right. It's difficult to be an engineer in those tracks. And like,
I didn't even mention how bumpy Coda is. Coda is extremely bumpy. And when you combine, I mean, you want to drive the car as low as possible to get the maximum downforce. But if you drive it too low, you're going to crash into the bumps and you're going to wear away the plank. And if it's a sprint weekend and your setup is locked in after like one practice session, we saw what happened with Lewis and Charles last year. It was tough. So that's a very difficult challenge for engineers.
Any concept that you personally, whether big or small, any concept that you think was given up too quickly and you would want to see it return, or anything that you haven't seen done in F1 that you'd like to see done differently?
No, I mean, I think I'm seeing a lot of convergence in things. I mean, things that aren't going to be pursued in the future are really done because the FIA has banned them. I really was interested in that armchair rear wing that Aston Martin had. We're seeing a slight variation of that with Williams this year, which is interesting. One of the things that I was really excited about, mostly because I actually saw this thing in person, was Mercedes brought the aerodynamically shaped slot gap separators for the front wing. Where normally it's just a piece of metal that connects the 2 elements, but they had like 4 or 5 aerodynamically shaped, curved slot gap separators. In fact, Ferrari used that in 2023, the entire season. And I think Haas also had it as well. I would have loved to see Mercedes try that again. That was something that they came up with. They didn't actually race it in COTA that year because of some questions about it. And then they never really raced it in that configuration. And I was always a little bit annoyed slightly that the team that invented that idea never actually raced it in a competitive session. So I would very much like to see that. I also would like to see Mercedes. They have one variation of the engine cover, not the slim one that is like kind of like what Red Bull made, but the very, very wide exit of the upper engine cover, like the cannon exits. It looks like Darth Vader's helmet in the back. I really, really like that design of the engine cover, and they only used it a few times, and so I'd like to see that come back again.
Speaking of front wings from Mercedes, can we talk about what we saw at testing? Like what concept is it that everybody's kind of worried about wanting it to be banned? Why is it quote unquote like maybe against the spirit of the regulations? Like what does all of this kind of mean? But mainly, I guess first, like what should we expect this to do for the car? Or if you have any best guesses what it could do for the car?
Yeah, so just a little aerodynamics thing on the back end of this to help give us some context of this. When a wing is uniformly loaded, it's loaded kind of the same all the way across the span. It doesn't tend to shed that much vorticity in the downstream part. There's not a lot of spinning downstream, but mostly it's just uniform, go up and go down over the airfoil. But if there's a discontinuous change in how heavily the wing is loaded, like quickly from one part of the span to the other part of the span, it spins the air around that section locally, and that vorticity is shed downstream. It's the same reason why we have a wingtip vortex that you'll see sometimes, like a plane landing, you'll see some condensation in the vortex coming back. It's because the loading on one side of that vortex is very strong, and on the other side is like not that much. And so it starts to cause spinning. That does create drag on its own, but in the context of a Formula One car, that vortex can actually be piped downstream, and the low pressure features of it, the entrainment features of it can be beneficial to parts downstream in the car. This was the famous Y250 vortex in the old version of the regulations. From 0 to 250 millimeters, horizontally from center line, you could not have a heavily loaded wing element. And then as soon as you got to the other side of 250, you could load it up as much as you want. And that discontinuity in the span-wise load distribution created a very strong vortex that proved to be very beneficial to teams going downstream. And so in the new regulations, to kind of stop teams from doing that, because it created a lot of outwash, created a lot of dirty air for the car behind to follow, to stop teams from doing that, they said, hey, listen, all four elements of your front wing need to connect to the nose, except maybe the first element, which can be like fully floating if the nose doesn't connect all the way to the front of them. But fundamentally, we need all four elements to connect to the nose. And that was an attempt to create a more uniform span-wise, left to right distribution of the loading of the airfoil to prevent, strong vortices from being shut off, at least from there. We still get some from the front wing end plate, which is a separate thing. So what Mercedes has done is they said, okay, we will follow the regulation and make sure every element of our wing goes all the way to the nose and it connects as you've required. We're just going to make the cord, the thickness of that part of the wing, remarkably short in the inside this region.
Right.
Not exactly where 250 is, but approximately where that is. So that effectively it's not there. It is there, like literally, there is something connecting it there. But aerodynamically speaking, that section of the wing is far, far less loaded than the outport section. And so this will give you a Y250-esque effect that we would have had before. It's not going to be as strong because you're only doing it through part of the wing and not the entire wing. But I've been talking to some of my esteemed colleagues in our not so secret F1 tech chat and saying, hey, listen, if this really works, there's no reason in principle why you could not extend this idea to two elements of the ring, make two elements big on the outside part, and then have two legality wires approaching the center of the center part of the car. There's going to be some structural challenges associated with that, but assuming those can be overcome, I don't see why you couldn't try the same thing again. That would create a stronger Y250 vortex effect And at that point, it will give you more performance, but the FIA is going to be like, hey, what are you guys doing over there? I'm not sure. And to be honest, it's a question even now, even though we've gotten the rubber stamp of approval from the FIA saying this design is legal.
Right.
You mentioned the political aspect of the sport. Yeah. And it's something that always has bothered me about it. But if you get enough teams to apply enough pressure to the FIA, they will look at something they've already done and potentially change their mind. So this is something that we have to, keep in mind of. But fundamentally, that new wing can give us, not exactly, but it can give us an approximation of the strong Y250 vortex that we've had previously that has beneficial effects downstream of the car, channeling airflow to the floor, working the front of the floor harder, generating outwash, did all these beautiful things. It made it harder for cars behind to follow. And that's why the FAA is so up in arms.
Yeah, because that was like goal number one and these regulation changes. It was always you could follow closely.
Or
closer.
Yeah, and you can to an extent, but the FAA does not have engineers as many of them or as talented engineers as Formula One teams. And F1 teams will find ways to erode that effect and benefit their own car while still technically adhering to the letter of the regulations, which is it's a constant fight from now until 8,000 years from now. F1 teams are going to be fighting the regulatory bodies, whatever they call it.
Super simple question, but just out of curiosity, with your opinion, do regulation changes come in too often, not often enough, or are you okay with because I think a lot of design will, I don't want to misspeak, but design changes happen during these regulation changes, like a lot of criteria changes on what you can and can't do anymore. Do you think that is a good thing for the sport, for the constant evolution of the sport? Would you like to have more time in between changes of regulations? What's your take on that?
I think 4 or 5 years is probably a good middle ground for technological developments, just to maintain relevance to the sport, to things that are happening, new hybrid power units and things like that. I mean, I'm happy for that. If you have it shorter than that on a pure design side, you don't really get enough time for the teams to have 2 or 3 iterations at the design. You don't see the ultimate version of what a car could be in that regulation set. But if you had it, 10 years between regulation changes, everything's going to be, every car's going to look exactly the same. It's going to be effectively IndyCar. But that being said, that's the design part of it, the frequency that I would like. On the safety side of it, I'm happy to make changes within a season and in consecutive seasons. For example, I mentioned Guan Yu Zhou's crash in Silverstone, where he was upside down and part of the roll hoop failed. There were changes made to regulations immediately, requiring stronger structures for the roll hoop and different requirements for vertical forces and tangential forces and all kinds of different directions to make F1 safer. And with regard to those changes to regulations, I'm happy for that to be every single season, and also
almost case by case.
Yeah, and also in-season changes due to technical directives if it gets bad enough. I mean, yes, we talk about the 2022 sort of downfall of Mercedes, but they created a car that was frankly a health hazard to the drivers, the extent to which it was porpoising, and the extent to which they were trying to get performance out of it was causing lasting problems for the drivers. And you could argue the political aspect of it. They just want to do X, Y, or Z to get something in their favor for design features and blah, blah. I don't care about that. What I care about is, are we doing what we can today to ensure the driver's well-being years from now? Because by the time we say, hey, this really is a problem, you've been ignoring it for 5 years, the FAA or whatever, it's too late. The damage is already done.
I'm wondering if there's a study. I was watching a Vox, little mini documentary about CTE effects in bobsledders, because their heads move around so much when they're, going down the path or whatever. And I don't know if the same thing can be said about F1. I don't know if there's the same sort of effects that are happening, but to your point of long lasting health, things that could be detrimental to their health, I don't know, I'm just, that kind of came to my mind because we're seeing so many more athletes be kind of afflicted with, brain injuries, but small ones over a long period of time, micro concussions that, over time deteriorates their brains. So I don't know. I just thought that was interesting because I never would have thought bobsledding would be kind of something that would cause that sort of damage. But I didn't know if there was something similar like that with Formula One.
We should be open-minded, and there shouldn't be any taboo subjects about this. I'm very passionate about two main things, one of which is engineering and motorsport, performance. But the other part of it is just safety. This year is going to be 30 years since we lost Ayrton Senna and Ratzenberger. And there have been huge developments in motorsport technology, safety in that time period. Yeah. And that's happened because we've taken every tragic accident and every potentially tragic accident and treated it seriously and made changes as a result. And I think that's one of the things that Formula One, I love the sport so much, it doesn't always love me back. But one of the things that I can give them huge credit for is being proactive about modifying the safety regulations in situations that warrant it. So that's always a good thing.
Yeah, I agree.
The Halo was a hot button. Hot button topic, and yet it's good. Like, how much empirical data do we have of all the times that it saved someone's life? And that absolutely should be literally number one. No. Like, even if that Halo made the car a lot slower, not saying that it did, but even if that were the case, like, the safety benefits alone is like, there's nothing to talk about here.
No. I mean, it is a fine line to walk, and I am sympathetic to people who push back on safety improvements. Obviously the safest thing to do is just go home. Just don't come and race. That would be the safest option. Mm-hmm. So what we have to do is find a middle ground between too safe and not safe enough. And it's very, it's almost morbid thinking about how many broken bones can we accept? How many career-ending injuries can we accept? But you have to do the calculation and say how rare is not rare enough for catastrophic injuries, and make engineering decisions based on it.
We wanted to see if we could do a little bit of a quick fire round with you, where we give you a team and you tell us maybe something that surprised you during testing, maybe something that you're looking forward to, maybe your thoughts in general. And so we're going to do it pretty quickly. So I will go through the list of teams and then we'll just listen to what you got. Is that okay with you?
Yes. Unplanned is the best for these. This is how you want it. You want as little preparation as possible, straight from the dome.
Right.
Okay. So team number 1 is Mercedes.
I'm impressed that they weren't totally wrong-footed by reinventing their design. W15 is the first design that is completely divested of any zero-pod philosophy. They were reinventing themselves, and it would be entirely possible for them to actually have a bad base to work from to contest this 2024 season. That hasn't happened. They've had a very positive 2024 testing campaign, and as I said, they've been able to modify the car during the tests in a way that replicates what the performance is in the sim. So not only does it match what the sim predictions are, but it matches the derivative, if that makes sense. They can change it in a way that's consistent with what the sim is doing. So I'm looking forward to Mercedes. I think they have a very high performance ceiling.
So next team is Haas F1.
Haas is going through a bit of a transformation phase. Yeah. Ayo Komatsu is a very talented engineer. I'll always back engineers. You're not gonna see me badmouth Komatsu. But he's very highly regarded. And the way an engineer runs a team is a very different way than the way other people run a team. Haas, Gene has tried to say by getting rid of Gunther, he's still serious about competing in Formula One despite being last and being the subject of much criticism. They're trying to turn things around, but they have a serious tire degradation problem. They did more laps in testing than anybody, not because they want to do performance, but because they just need to figure out this tire deg problem. So I figured out that they will eventually get a handle on it. They may surprise some people as well, but they're just in a transformation period trying to figure out their new identity.
Red Bull Racing.
I'm impressed with how bold they were in terms of changing a design that has proven the most successful car in a single season in Formula One history, and they said it's not good enough. And in fact, the iteration we're going to do on that car is not good enough. We will be caught. So I am impressed by them having the balls, basically, to take ideas that didn't work for other teams and try to make them work for their own car, and seemingly pulling it off so far. That being said, yes, they're the team to beat. but I think it still might be closer in the end this season than even they are predicting.
Next team, McLaren.
McLaren didn't have as smooth a testing as I thought they might have, given how strong they were last season and how strongly they ended the season. I think they expected to be faster or more obviously faster in the testing. Now, to be clear, they didn't even bring out the softest C5 tires for the test. They never even tried that. So we haven't seen their ultimate pace. But there were some mechanical gremlins and there were a few other things. I think they would have wanted to get a little bit more running done than they did. But that being said, they're going to be in the fight. I mean, they're right there. That shift they made ever since, I'll say, Austria last year was real, and it's going to stick. They're going to be a factor from here on out.
Aston Martin.
Aston Martin finds themselves in a very difficult position. You would much rather start a season slowly and then finish on a high. That way you know where the performance is. You know how to design a car to be successful. Aston Martin did the opposite. They started very well and then lost their pace. That's a bad situation to be in because you don't know for sure what to do to fix the car. And they certainly are not in a situation right now where they are blowing away the timing sheets the way they were last year. So maybe they were sandbagging harder than anyone else. I don't know. But I feel like they're going to have a slightly more low-key season this year than last year. That doesn't mean that some tracks won't suit them really well and they perform super well. That car has great traction and it has great degradation. It's very, very low degradation. So maybe Bahrain will suit them. Maybe Monaco will suit them. You know, they had a chance to win a race last year, but didn't quite pull it off.
Next one is RB. That's how it says it on the list.
For a half second, I heard Arby's. Right?
They have a branding problem.
And I was like,
they have a brand.
And I was like, man, these sponsors change quickly.
Right.
When did Arby's get in the game?
Title sponsor too, you know.
Right.
RB is going to be the talk of the town because we don't know what the real pace is. As I said, RB or VCAR, whatever we're going to call them, they represent what everyone fears. They believe that they will actually do what other people have tried to do, which is to make a transformative change in their pace overnight, essentially, by having a closer partnership with the defending champions Red Bull. So if RB if they finish on the podium in Bahrain, you're gonna be hearing some incredible noise over the next couple of months about the legality.
Zack Brown's gonna get a megaphone. I mean, he doesn't need one, and he doesn't need one.
He might burst a blood vessel.
So
that's keep an eye on him. Keep an eye on him because they may have pace.
Yeah. Next team up is Ferrari.
Ferrari's looking pretty good. I don't know how good yet, but they're looking good. Obviously, just pure like on paper, they finished the test fastest and had a really good long run, and they fundamentally changed aspects of their car to be more Red Bull-esque, but also just adopting a wider philosophy for engine cooling and side-pod design and inlet. It's all different. So the more you change a car, the wider the potential horizon is for how good it can be. It could also be worse too, a lot worse. But this testing has proved to me that they also didn't have a problem with changing their car. They're also starting from a very strong position. It's only up from here for Ferrari.
Yeah.
Next one is Kick Sauber.
Sauber is I'm going to call them the Hinwil team.
What team?
Hinwil. Hinwil is a place in Switzerland where their team is based.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
Hinwil. They actually might surprise some folks. I do think that Guan Yu Zhou's run at the end of testing was a glory run for sure. But I do think that they did make a switch to pro-rod front suspension. That also could help them in certain ways. They've also been playing around the anti-dive. I think the entire grid is going to be closer overall in this third iteration of the regulations, or the third time through the regulations. And so as a consequence of that, all the teams will be closer and they will be a little bit higher up as well. So don't be surprised by them.
Last one is Williams.
Williams had a difficult test. Williams had the least number of miles of anyone. That can be a challenge for anybody, but Williams has ambitions beyond this year, beyond next year, and they're trying to outgrow their previous philosophy of making a car that's very slippery and fast in a straight line, very good top speed, but not necessarily very good in downforce and corners and things. They're trying to redesign their cars to have more downforce, maybe not be quite as fast in straight line, but be better performing at a wider range of circuits. So the car is fundamentally different this year than it was last year. And the drivers are reporting that. They're having to relearn how to drive the car fundamentally because it just drives so differently than last year's car. So they had difficulty in the test, but I think that there will be some surprise results for Williams, probably coming from Albon. Let's just be honest. It will probably be him that delivers it. But I think that they're going in the right direction. They need money and they need some luck as well. But they're definitely pushing in the right direction for sure.
Yeah. Agreed.
Bonus question. This one's for me. We mentioned Mercedes has potential for developing the car throughout the year. And we talked about basically, you mentioned a bit specifically Aston Martin and how they might do this year with development. But so that sparked with me, like I've said it a bunch of times, but Aston and McLaren last year had a very completely opposite type of year in my opinion, and that was heavily a development problem. That was heavily Aston didn't develop anymore. They started really well. McLaren, the opposite, did not start very well, developed a really strong car at the end. When we talk about the potential or your belief in a team to be able to develop, who do you think, who comes to mind when we talk about who do you really believe are capable of, obviously there's so many variables, but who in general do you see, I believe in that team's ability to develop a car throughout a year?
Believe it or not, it's Mercedes. And I believe this for the wrong reasons, which is to say, I believe in their development potential because they started the past 2 seasons so badly.
Yeah.
They've started so badly.
Yeah.
They started with a car that initially they could not drive down a straight without crashing into the ground, and they won a race. They built a car in 2023 where they reinvented the design philosophy of that car halfway through the season, and they finished second in the Constructors' Championship.
Yeah.
Right? They are starting this season better than any of the past 2 seasons, and they absolutely have the firepower to develop in the course of a season, along with McLaren as well.
Yeah.
So I absolutely believe that Mercedes is going to be a very strong force this season, not just because of their development potential, but because they're starting so much better this year than in the past. Yeah. Again, fingers crossed, toes crossed, whatever else you want to cross. But I believe that they have a very high performance ceiling that we're just trying to explore the contours of.
I this episode has given me faith in Mercedes. One thing that I wanted us to do before we cut the episode, I wanted to see if we can leave the listeners with good concepts to go read on if they're interested. So, for example, maybe read a little bit about what CFD is and how it works. We mentioned the rake that they use we mentioned rake angle, but we also mentioned the rake that is used during testing. We see what is it? The Flovis during testing. So that's really interesting.
And we didn't even mention the tufts. The Mercedes uses the tufts, the little pieces of wool that they'll tape to parts of the car, and they fly around in an interesting way. The reason why it's better than Flovis is because it's real time. It can react in a dynamic way to flow conditions. Flovis kind of just like averages out what's happening over the car while it's drying. But old school technology is coming back. This is good.
Yeah. No, anything like that, because that's exactly what anything like that you see that I haven't seen, like Flovis, like the rake, like the tufts, anything else like that they use that what might be interesting to dig into.
So I have written an article about CFD and its applications to Formula One. I wrote it a couple of years ago, in fact, at this point, but it is pinned at the top of my profile. I highly recommend reading that to get a basic feel for what CFD is about and how it's used for Formula One. But also, I've compiled a list of what I think are the best technical accounts in the Twitter space. People that I know who know what they're talking about and post pretty regularly. I haven't posted as regularly as I want to because I've been busy. But there's a list that I have. I can share that with you guys, and I can post it soon as well. Just so people can scroll the right people to get a feel for what's actually going on. And as far as free resources to learn about things like aerodynamics and other things, believe it or not, MIT's OpenCourseware, OCW, is one of the best resources that's freely available to everyone that I've ever come across. And their unified courses on fluid mechanics, I want to say it's 1609 and 1610. There's some lecture notes there by Mark Drella that are just fantastic about learning about basic aerodynamic concepts, vorticity, circulation, the Cutter condition, trailing edge condition, and, lifting theorems and all kinds of cool stuff. If you want to learn more about the way air flows around objects and the way objects affect the way the air moves, MIT OCW is one of the best sources to get free course notes on technical subjects. And so I can also give you guys a link for that.
Nice. Thank you.
We have talked about many things, and I have a lot of things to study after this. For example, I need to catch up on what diffusers do specifically. You mentioned it great, but I need to read that stuff. Do you want to plug anything before we go? Is there anything that you're excited about that you want to share? We will have the documentation and the pin tweet and obviously your socials, but anything else you would want to just plug? This is your time.
I don't have anything to plug apart from Peace on Earth. And what I mean by that is F1 Twitter is going to explode once the season starts, and the fan bases are going to start fighting each other prematurely. In fact,
yes.
all I would recommend.
Starting.
I'm going to recommend unity. I'm going to recommend tolerance, and I'm going to recommend just getting offline if the situation calls for it.
The occasional touching of grass.
Log out, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it doesn't have to be grass. It could just be concrete. Something outside.
Yeah.
Because as you know, F1 Twitter can be very heated. And the good parts of it can be really good, but the bad parts of it can be extraordinarily bad. So I really wouldn't I wouldn't hesitate to use that block button if necessary, but let's just try to keep things civil this year. All right.
I love that.
Not naming names.
Yeah. But yeah, thanks for having me on, guys. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you for being here.
At Natural Paradigm.
Natural Paradigm. That's
you
can say paradigm. You can say paradigm if you want. That's fine.
It's my ESL. Those Paragon Paradigm. Or those I get confused.
I might change this to that later. You don't know.
Well, thank you so much. If you're still listening, if you're still watching, remember to like, comment, subscribe, share with a friend. Let us know if you like the episode. I think that this would be a great opportunity to bring Bryson back in towards the mid-season. If you're not too busy, we can talk about who's developing really well, maybe what you like, what you don't like. As a reminder to everyone, Tasha still owes us a livery design. Never will I let it go. Thank you very much to everybody. Thank you so much again to Bryson. Thank you to Tasha every time just for existing and being here because she's so dope. I've been Mario. Tasha, any last words before we head out?
No, this was great. I really love this talk. And thank you to everybody who's made it this far in the episode. Just little quick reminder that we're going to be back on Friday. Quali's on Friday. And the race is on Saturday. So don't wake up on Sunday and miss everything. So just keep that in mind. I hope everybody enjoys the season. I'm really excited about this, despite the fact that, Red Bull looks like they're about to take it. But whatever, I'm still excited. I don't know why. So maybe just the brain worms. I don't know. That being said, everybody, no matter what happens in life, keep all the black stuff. Bye.
Bye.
Look, mate, if you've got this far, clearly you like what we do. So here's a link to subscribe to the Quickstop F1 family. Give that a click. And here's another link to some more cool on our channel. Sorry, cool stuff. And remember, no matter what happens, keep it on the black stuff. Click the stuff. Click the links. Click the links. Click the links. There. They're there.